Okay, our topic for this evening is instructional models. As you can see from our lecture organizer, this follows the presentation or discussion we had last week on second language acquisition. So now that we know we've got students that are second language learners, English as a second language learner, we're going to discuss the types of bilingual and English models and a few English language strategies that are used in those models, as well as some models for teaching bilingual students who are in our special ed classrooms. And the following week, on the 10th, we will be discussing assessment. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about are bilingual models. When you hear the word bilingual, what you really need to think about is that means at least two languages. So in bilingual models, two languages are used. The first bilingual model is what's called the bilingual with transitional support. This is where both English and a first language is used. For discussion, I'm going to use the first language as Spanish, since the majority of the students in the Los Angeles area, that is their first language. So again, bilingual transition or transitional bilingual education is where both English and Spanish in this case is used. It is usually for about 1 to 3 years, and after those 3 years, no further instruction is given in Spanish. The overall goal of this model is to have students transition out of the bilingual program into an English-only classroom. So the students receive initial instruction in most of their content areas in their home language or first language, which is most likely Spanish, while being taught in English. This is known, the Transitional Bilingual Ed program is known as a subtractive environment because it promotes monolingual learning in English and promotes that the students stop using or replaces their first language, in this case Spanish, replaces Spanish with English. So they say it's subtracting from the student, it's taking away from the student. In this transitional bilingual ed program, it builds students' English skills and uses their first language to guide that English development. Transitional bilingual education models are the most widely used program, not only in this city but also around the country. Now you'll notice at the bottom of that slide it says early exit. That's because first language instruction, in this case Spanish, is only for about 2 to 3 years, and it's as quick. They try to get the kid out of this bilingual class as fast as possible so that they can go into an English-only class. So it's called early exit because they really, some school districts it's only for 2 years, others it's for 3. This program, this model, the Transitional Bilingual Ed model, really supports BICS, the basic interpersonal skills that we talked about last week, as opposed to CALPS. Not a lot of CALP or academic language. So the focus is really on what's needed to be successful in an English-only classroom. The problem with this transitional bilingual ed is that it tends to be kids tend to be segregated. It tends to be much more remedial in nature. Teachers are known to water down their curriculum because they're trying to cover a lot. And of course, the big drawback also is it's not a lot of time, as we talked last week about how long it takes to acquire a language, to academic language. It takes anywhere from 4 to 6 years. Okay, the next bilingual model program is what's called developmental or maintenance bilingual ed. In this model, both first language and second language are considered to be an asset. It's considered to be a really good thing to be bilingual and to continue being bilingual. So yeah, we might see this more in K through 5, but once the kids start in kindergarten and maybe go through 5th grade, there are a lot of developmental maintenance bilingual ed programs that are now considered continuing into middle school and high school. Students in this model are encouraged to be proficient in both languages, English and their home language. In the example I'm giving is Spanish. Literacy is considered very important. Uh, this is considered where the transition bilingual ed model was considered a subtractive model. This is considered a additive environment or additive model because it's adding skills, it's promoting bilingualism and biculturalism over the long term. It's adding another language to the student's repertoire. So not only does it add language, but it also maintains the student's language and culture while developing academic and language proficiency in English. Now you'll notice on this slide it says late exit. That's because in this program, many kids stay in this maintenance or developmental program for up to 6 years with some support in their first language, even after they transition into an English-only class. And in some cases, once they leave elementary school, they go into English only, but they still are allowed to get some support in their first language. Okay, the next bilingual model, again, 2 languages, is called the one-way dual language immersion. So immersion is just what it sounds like. It's plopping a kid in where they're not getting a lot of support. Think of immersing something into water, if you will. In this one, the example could be like teaching Spanish to English speakers. So English speakers might be considered, the first bullet there, English speakers would be considered the language majority students, and they are learning a minority language, in this case Spanish. Or in some cases, there are some one-way dual language immersion programs where all instruction is in Mandarin Chinese for English-speaking children. So in this one, it's one-way dual language because the students are becoming bilingual and biliterate in both English and another language. Okay? But in most cases, for example, Chinese students would already know English. They're not learning English. It's the English students who are learning the Chinese. Now, another kind of immersion program is called a two-way language immersion. In this case, you've got, for example, Chinese students who are learning English and English students who are learning Chinese. And so the students are developing skills in both languages. Many times this dual language starts in kindergarten and goes all the way through to, I know some programs that go through 8th grade, excuse me. This two-way immersion reinforces first language and fosters development of second language. And so students might receive up to 40% or more of instruction in their first language and will continue using their first language even as they're learning English. And even after they become proficient in English, instruction is done in both languages. There is a dual language immersion program right here in the San Fernando Valley if anybody is interested in hearing about it or knowing where it is. The last bilingual program where 2 languages are used as a way of educating students is called the newcomer program. Newcomer programs are primarily for secondary students. I don't really know of any program that's for elementary. It offers recent immigrants a safe educational atmosphere that fosters rapid language learning. It helps with them become more acculturated, used to the United States, to our school system. The common goal here is to help the students acquire enough English so that they can move into a regular language support program. It does do some academics, but it would be more everyday academics that are needed to get around in a typical high school, for example, and to understand the educational expectations. It does help them develop their first language literacy if they don't already have some, and how to integrate into American life. Generally, newcomer programs, the students stay in for about 2 years. And newcomer programs can either be a school in and of itself, or it could be a program within a school, or some districts have it as an intake center at the district office. It really is, different districts do it differently. All right, so in each of those 4 bilingual models, there are different methods that teachers use, regardless of which of the 4 I just went over. So these are the methods that are discussed in your book, and very quickly, the alternate method is where one language is used one day and the other language is used the next day. In the eclectic method, this is where some subjects are taught in one language while other subjects are taught in a second language. The translation method, number 3, is where you have a monolingual teacher who relies on someone fluent, usually an assistant, to translate what's being said. So this would be if you have like an English-speaking teacher and a Spanish-speaking classroom assistant. The teacher would do most of the instructing, and the aide translates for the general ed teacher, or special ed teacher for that matter. Sometimes the translation is done by other students in some classrooms. In number 4, the concurrent method, this is where the teacher switches back and forth between 2 languages in an ongoing and informal basis, depending on student comprehension. And then the preview-review method is where those of you that are familiar with the 9-step lesson plan, the opening of the lesson could be done in English. The body of the lesson could be done in, for example, Spanish. And the review of the lesson, or the closing of the lesson, could be done again in English. Or it could be switched. The opening of the lesson could be in Spanish, body of the lesson in English, closing of the lesson with the review again is in Spanish. So those are just 4 methods or strategies that are commonly used within a bilingual model program. So now we're going to move to English-only models. So as opposed to a bilingual model, which has 2 languages, the English-only model has, you guessed it, just one. Want to take a guess which one it is? Good job, it's English. Okay, so the first one is what's called ESL pullout, English as a Second Language pullout. Los Angeles, California doesn't call them this anymore. They might call it ELD pullout for English language development, but other places in the country still call it an ESL pullout. So again, ESL is English as a Second Language. In this one, it could be for a half hour a day to an hour of a day where a student is pulled out of their general ed classroom, or even in their special ed classroom. They're pulled out of it. Instruction is done in vocabulary, grammar, oral language, maybe spelling, but there's no integration. Whoever's doing the pullout, and very often it's a classroom assistant, a bilingual aide, but whoever is doing the pulling out doesn't talk to the classroom teacher. So there's no integration between what's being done in the pullout with what's going on in the classroom. This is the most implemented program around the country. It is also the most ineffective. Shouldn't be a big surprise. And it's generally used in elementary schools. Okay, so English language development is usually a full class period or 2 class periods. Students generally are grouped. This is done a lot in middle school and high schools, particularly here in Los Angeles. So students are grouped by their level of English proficiency. So you might have a English ELD emerging class and an English ELD bridging class. You might have a history um, early, the first level of proficiency, a history class that is all for kids at that very basic early level of language proficiency. You might have science classes like that. So students may take an ELD class that's tied with English language arts or with content, science, history, and they might be in these classes every grade level until they exit out of the English language development programs. Okay, the third one is called Structured English Immersion, and this is where teachers, the content teachers have, or elementary teachers, have content background and knowledge in second language acquisition. And the lessons all have not only content objectives, but they also have language objectives. The goal here is to work on receptive skills and oral language. So in this structured English immersion, sometimes some districts will allow a minimal amount of the first language to be used to help explain things to kids who are really at that first level of language proficiency. But they do not teach the kids to read or write in their first language. Okay? It's the goal, as it says there, is language, literacy, and content learning in English only. So English is taught very often through the content, so through history or science. Now there's a number of different kinds of structured English immersion programs. One is called Sheltered English. Sheltered English is used to help students access content concepts and to promote those CALP skills again. You don't hear too much about sheltered English being used in K through 5. But in middle school and high school, a lot of teachers use sheltered English. The instruction, again, is focused on content. It's a very step-by-step process, as you're going to see in a moment. It uses very small amounts of the first language only to supplement that English-only curriculum, if they use any of the first language at all. You'll notice there is a link there to a little video clip where you can see somebody doing a sheltered lesson. Okay, one type of sheltered instruction is called SEDI. And SEDI, specially designed academic instruction in English, is used all over the country. It's used a lot here in Los Angeles. It's specifically designed to impart content knowledge using English, using the second language. The emphasis still is on content instruction, and there are some systematic instructional strategies to provide access to core curriculum. And the teachers are providing the same academic level as native English speakers would get. So it's not watering down the content the way we saw with some of the other models that I talked to a minute ago. SEDI also is a lot of what makes SEDI so effective has to do with the teacher attitude and the teacher's willingness and openness to learn from the students and to listen to the student's background knowledge and to make the instruction comprehensible. And we'll talk in a minute about more comprehensibility. All the SEDI programs, and I'm going to show you one in a second, really have a lot of interaction between the students that goes on. So the most common SEDI or sheltered instruction program, I should say, sheltered instruction is sort of the umbrella term. SEDI is one, SIOP is another one. They overlap very, very similar. I like the Sheltered Instruction um, Observation Protocol, or SIOP, because it is very systematic and explicit, and I think it's easier to learn. So there is a book there, Making Content Comprehensible for English Learners, the SIOP model, that you can pick up. It's got some great strategies and ideas for teaching students who are English language learners. Okay, so the SIOP model, let me go back one second. The SIOP model has three components, and I'm going to go over each of the three components with you. Again, this is primarily, it's almost always used in secondary, either middle school or high school, with students who are English language learners. But as you're going to see, a lot of the strategies and the components are really effective, what we know about effective teaching. All right, the first component is what's called preparation. This is where the teacher prepares the lesson and thinks about the students in the classroom. So just as I mentioned in one of the other ELL models, all of the lessons in the SIOP model uses the teacher not only explains the content objective, what we're going to be doing today in science or in history or English language arts, but they also write and inform the students what the language objective is. In most classes, they will have the content objective, which would come from the Common Core standard that's being worked on, as well as a language objective, which, as you're going to discover later on in the semester, comes from the English language development standards that we started looking at last week. The number three, the teacher in preparing the lesson has to think about the content concepts. And again, this would be coming from looking at the standard, as well as thinking about the students' first language skills, literacy skills, language proficiency, reading ability, when we take students into consideration when we're preparing and planning a lesson. That all has to come into this preparation component. Number 5, adapting the content. This is where we plan our lesson to fit the Common Core state standard as well as the ELD standard, and then we think about how we might have to adapt it for our kids with special needs, and then to plan some meaningful activities. So all of that goes into preparation. And don't freak out. By the end of the semester, you'll know how to do all of this. Right now, we're just going over the major components. I should say that all of these major components the majority of these components will be included in the lesson plan you'll be writing at the end of the semester. Oh boy. Okay, so that was the first component, preparation. The second component is instruction, and this is really the meat of the SIOP model. The first thing we have to do when we're thinking about instruction is to build background knowledge. And as you can see, there's 3 different ways that we do that. First is to link concepts to what the student already knows or to their experiences. Some of our students come with a lot of background knowledge or prior knowledge about a subject. Some come with a little bit, and some come with none. So we have to think about how we're going to help build that knowledge. One way is to read them a story, read an article, show them a video. Even for secondary students, maybe read them a picture book that that has great pictures that'll help build some background knowledge. Another is number 8 is to explicitly link their past learning with the new concepts. Most of our students, particularly in special ed, do not automatically make the connection between previous lessons or previous learning with a current lesson we're doing. So we need to help them with that. And we can explicitly help them make those links by asking questions like, who who remembers what we did in the last lesson, or who remembers the last skill we did, or how does this skill that we're learning today, or this topic that we're going to be discussing today, how does it relate to something we've already talked about, or maybe something you've learned about in another classroom, or someplace you've gone in your own life? So how does it relate to their lives and to previous learning? And certainly the lecture organizer, which is also known as a unit organizer, is a great way to help students with that because it's got the visual. Finally, we want to, in building background, we need to emphasize key vocabulary. We need to help students recognize some of the content words, the word parts, and start helping them learn some of the key vocabulary. So we need to be cognizant of that. And in a minute or two, we'll talk about some ways to build key vocabulary into your lesson. And we'll certainly be talking about that later on in the semester. Another part of instruction is to make sure that our thinking about how we're going to make our lesson comprehensible and to make sure that there is comprehensible input. So there's 3 little pointers there, 10, 11, and 12. And I mentioned comprehensible input when we talked about second language acquisition last week, that when parents are talking to their newborn or their toddlers, we tend to use a lot of comprehensible input. We use a lot of facial expressions. We slow down when we're talking. We may use similar vocabulary over and over again rather than using a lot of synonyms. That's what comprehensible input is, and that's why children tend to learn their first language, because the parents are taking care to make sure it's comprehensible. And so I've given you two slides with 14 ideas for how to make lessons more comprehensible. So I've already talked about number 10. Number 11 is to explain academic tasks clearly, not only for assignments, but also in activities, explaining them in a step-by-step manner. Modeling, yes, my favorite word. Demonstrate or showing them a finished product before they start doing it so they can see what the end result looks like. That is very comprehensible. And you can do comprehensible input not just orally, it can also be done written. You can give them written examples. And finally, using a variety of techniques. That's what's on the next couple of slides right here. So there's lots of ways of making lessons comprehensible. The third step or third idea that we want to take into consideration when we're looking at instruction is to think about the strategies that we're using. So, for example, providing ample opportunities for students to use what it is we're teaching them. For letting them practice over and over again, and giving them time to talk about what they're doing or to practice what they're doing. So throughout the lesson, to assist them and support their understanding, having them paraphrase what they're doing or what you've just said, or you paraphrase, having them think aloud what they're doing. Doing things like, I'm looking at number 14, using scaffolding, teaching the students mnemonic devices. You all know what a mnemonic device is, you just may not know what the word is. A mnemonic device is, if you think of PEMDAS, which many of the math teachers use to teach kids the order of operations, mnemonic devices have been shown to be extremely effective in helping students remember lists and items and order of doing things. For example, when I was in 5th grade, which was back in the dark ages, in 5th grade, we used to require that students learned the 5 Great Lakes in the United States. I don't think anybody teaches that anymore. But anyway, when I was in 5th grade, my teacher taught us the word homes as a way to remember the 5 Great Lakes. Roll tape forward some, 55 years, and I still remember the five Great Lakes. Homes, H, Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. That shows the effectiveness of mnemonic devices because I learned that 50, 60 years ago, 55 years ago, whatever, and I still have never forgotten that. I'm not called on very much to tell people what the five Great Lakes are, so I thought I would impress you. Okay, um, and then use number 15, use a variety of question types. So for example, making sure that you don't only ask questions that are at the, do you remember the name of the character? Or what happened in the story, which tend to be lower level types of questions, but asking some higher order thinking skills, asking the students to analyze, to compare and contrast, to synthesize information, to draw conclusions. Those are higher level type questions and strategies that we can ask our students. Okay, the next part of instruction is interaction. You're going to hear me say it. You've already heard me say it a number of times. You're going to hear it a lot this semester. We want our English language learners to interact, to talk, and interacting with each other is tremendous. So during discussions, allowing frequent opportunities for interaction among each other, with us, that's one of the reasons you're doing your shadowing assignment. We need to learn to shut up a little bit and let even me, I know, hard to believe, I need to learn to shut up so that our students can talk about what they're learning and their experiences. We need to support their language and content objectives, and have them do this in different group configurations. So being in dyads, which is couples, in trios, getting into quads. So having two students meet, do something, and talk about it, then meet up with two other students. So now they're in quads to discuss or to show what they're doing. For number 18, we need to provide sufficient. For our English language learners, it takes them longer to process what we're saying to them in English. Also for our students with disabilities, it takes. So we've got to ask a question, give a direction, and then pause. Count to 10. Or even do what I saw a tremendous teacher do one year was he would ask a question and then he would stand and he'd say, let's just all think about that for a minute. And he would stand in front of the group and everybody was quiet. Takes some training on both the teacher and the student's part, but it was a wonderful, respectful way that I still have not mastered. And number 19 is to give ample opportunities for students to clarify key concepts in their first language. So as needed, having an aide or a peer, or even explain what a concept is in the first language, or even have some books around the same topics that you're covering in first language, because you may, particularly those of you who are working in secondary, you may have some students who are literate in their first language. Doesn't happen as much in Spanish, unfortunately, because so many of our kids came over here when they were quite young. But with some of our Asian students and even some of our Mideastern students, they did go to school in their home country, and so they do have some literacy skills in their first language. So letting them look at the content in their first language will help them in the long run. You can also use some the translation device on Google if all else fails and you don't have anybody else to turn to. Okay, another segment of the instruction component is practice, 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 and application. Letting students use hands-on materials or manipulatives to practice new content knowledge, giving them multiple opportunities to practice, to create, to experiment, to rearrange objects, This helps reduce, anytime they can do something kinesthetically, will help reduce the language load. And it's exhausting to hear English all the time when you're not fluent. It also helps, using manipulatives or hands-on helps to connect abstract concepts. Number 21, providing these activities in content and language knowledge in the classrooms would be like discussing and makes, again, abstract concepts more concrete. So doing things like clustering information, using graphic organizers, having students get into cooperative groups for solving problems, doing discussion circles, reporting out, and again, not just written. You can have cooperative groups or discussion circles that are written, where one student writes something and the paper gets passed to another member of their group. So the final one, providing activities that integrate all language skills. Language skills are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Every lesson, regardless of the content, so even math lessons, should have a listening component, a speaking component, a reading component, and a writing component. So helpful for our second language learners as well as our kids with disabilities. And the final part of instruction is to think about our lesson delivery. Okay, so again, our lesson needs to support the content objective, which comes from the Common Core standard for whatever topic or subject area you're working in. The language objectives come from, for us in California, from our ELD standards that we started looking at. You will know exactly how to use these by the end of the semester and by the time you write your lesson plan. Number 25, making sure that these students are doing and engaged 90 to 100% of the time. Doing think, pair, share. Doing something I like to call chunk and chew, where we say something, then we pause every 10 minutes. So we talk for 10 minutes. I need to learn to do this. Talk for 10 minutes, pause, give the students time to discuss and reflect. In other words, to chew what we're telling them or discussing, and then go back to talking again. Yeah, I definitely need to work on this one. Okay, number 26 is to make sure that we're pacing our lessons appropriately. As I said with comprehensibility, the rate that we talk can be very difficult. Think about if you've ever had to call a customer service center for your credit card or for something else, and you get one of the operators who's sitting over in Malaysia or India somewhere, and they have a very thick accent, and some of them talk really quickly, and you feel like, what are they saying? I can't keep up with them. That's what our kids feel like in our classroom. So depending on the content, if they don't have any background knowledge, and then we're talking really quickly only in English, they're not going to pick up as much as if we, one, slow down, and also if the content is a little more familiar to them. The final component of the SIOP method is reviewing and evaluation. So at the end of our lesson, and those of you that know the 9-step lesson plan, this would be in the closing, is to review the vocabulary that we discussed or that was found in the lesson or in the reading or in the lecture. To review those key concepts again. To also provide feedback to the students regularly during the lesson, to be evaluating during the lesson, to watch their body language, their facial expressions. You can tell when students lose engagement when they what's the word I'm looking for? When they fade out. I know it when you do, just like I just did. Anyway, you can validate what they're saying. And so if a student says something, you can say to them, instead of saying, well, you're not saying it correctly, say to them something like, is this what you're saying? And you say it correctly. You model it for them correctly. Very similar to the way parents when their children are learning to talk, if a child says paschetti instead of spaghetti, most parents don't say it's spaghetti. Now repeat after me. Spaghetti, spaghetti, spaghetti. Say it 3 times by yourself. That's not what we do with young children. What we do is we just say, oh, you want some spaghetti. And when the child hears it enough and they mature a little bit, then they all of a sudden say it correctly, and that baby talk tends to go away. If we say to them, though, oh, you want paschetti? Oh, it's so cute when you want paschetti, then they tend to continue saying paschetti. So we want to practice that also in our classroom, modeling good language. And then conducting assessments of comprehensive and learning at the end of our lesson. You certainly can do that through looking at work samples, but you can also ask them to, you can check in with them. So how many understood this? Thumb up, thumb down. How many feel comfortable with this? Hold up a sign that says agree or disagree, or yes, no. Or you could do something like a response board where they write an answer and hold it up on a dry erase board. You could also have them have on your board, your whiteboard in the classroom, numbers 1 through 3, and you say to them at the end of the lesson, here was our goal or our objective for today's lesson. Put a number 1 if you don't feel you've met the objective or you can't do the objective. Put a number 2 if you can't or didn't do the objective, but you feel you've made progress towards it. And put a number 3 if you fully can meet the objective. You could also have them fill out a little piece of paper before they walk out of your class period, and they don't have to put their name on it, but that way you can see which of the students met the objective and which may, and it's a good way to evaluate ourselves on how we did. Okay, so that's the SIOP method. Now, so I covered ESL pullout, ELD method, or ELD model, sheltered instruction, SEDI, SIOP. Within all of those English only or primarily English only programs, there are some methods that classroom teachers can use within those English only programs. Your book talks about, I believe, all of these. Current ESL is just integrating language into the curriculum. The general classroom teacher does that. Traditional ESL is where English is taught in isolation. That's like the ESL pullout program. Number 3, TPR. This is where there's an association between language and getting the body involved, or getting kids moving around and doing things, lots of facial expressions. I have given you a video link that you might want to look at of a teacher using what's called TPR, total physical response, in a classroom if you'd like to see. It's used a lot with elementary students, but it's also very effective with secondary. This is the one that I mentioned last week when I said Steve Krashen was known for doing a lesson in Dutch, and within 15-20 minutes, adults understood exactly what he was talking about, even though they couldn't speak a word of Dutch. And he was amazing when he used to do, he still does do it. Okay, going back to these English methods, ESL in the content area is where the teacher organizes objectives around academic subjects and grade level curriculum, and then tries to do some ESL techniques. The silent way is not used very widely. The only time I've ever seen it is in your textbook, so don't worry about it. Okay? All right. Now, I have given you, and I know you can't see it real well on this slide, but I've given you the document on Moodle under under this link for this video recording. And what I suggest you do is print it out and use it as a study guide. It's a nice summary. It's a comparison and contrast of the bilingual and ESL only models that I just went over. You'll notice that the far right column is empty. That's just where you can write down some of those English methods or bilingual methods, you could write those in there, or as we learn some strategies later in the semester, you could write them there. But then you'll also notice that there are some other blank spaces. I did that purposely because I want you to go back and look at the slides, as well as maybe listen to this lecture again if you need to, and see if you can fill in the holes. And we will go over this when we see each other again. But you need to try to do this on your own. It's a great way to review the bilingual and ESL models that we talked about. Okay, finally, I want to just touch on the bilingual special ed models. There are 3 of them. The first one, and just as this sounds, these are models that are used in special ed classes that have bilingual or students who maybe don't even speak any English. And we get a lot of that, particularly with our students who may have more moderate disabilities and severe disabilities, as well as students who their disability makes it difficult for them to process language and therefore to learn another language. So the first one, bilingual support, that means that there's a monolingual special ed teacher who receives bilingual support, usually from a bilingual aide. So for example, the special day class teacher, resource teacher only speaks English, and the special ed assistant provides support and to the special ed teacher in the language of the student. This model should really only be used when you don't have a bilingual teacher available, obviously. The coordinated service model is where you might have 2 fully credentialed teachers. So you might have a special ed teacher who is monolingual, but a bilingual general ed classroom teacher. And in this one, you have good team teaching that goes on. And this is something we see all over the city, where a bilingual general ed teacher is paired with a special ed teacher, maybe a resource teacher that's doing push-in services. The special ed teacher doesn't speak any, for example, Spanish, but the general ed classroom teacher does. So they co-plan and team teach in the classroom. Finally, the integrated is where, this is what I was. The last classroom I had with LA Unified, I would be considered an integrated. At least I'm integrated with something. Anyway, that's a bilingual special ed teacher, and it thrills me to no end to see so many bilingual people going into special education, because this is really the best of both worlds. So this is where you've got a special ed certified teacher who is also bilingual and can provide services to the students, either in a special ed class or in a general ed class. Within a general ed class, can still provide special ed services bilingually in English as well as in another language. And so that is the lecture for this week. I hope you have a good week. Thank you.